Thank you very much, Ted. I'm delighted to be here. My topic tonight is homelessness. In fact, it has a wonderful catchy title that was presented to me by our coordinator, Does Homelessness Mean Less? Let me begin by saying a little bit about how I first became involved with homeless people. I grew up in Baltimore and in an old house in the central city. My parents, who are both professionals, decided they wanted to live in the central city rather than joining all of the other Anglo people who were engaged in white flight to the suburbs. So we lived downtown, and we had a house that had a basement, as every other house did in Baltimore, and especially, well, in Baltimore, whether it was the suburbs or whether it was downtown. I remember one morning, I must have been probably in the 5th grade, when my mother went down into the basement, and I heard her calling in this sort of a loud voice to my father, saying, "Please, you need to come down quickly, quickly." And sure enough, there was a homeless man who was sleeping in the basement. My parents presumed after they met this gentleman that he'd been sleeping there for quite a while. I mean, he'd come back and forth. Because we had what was, the house originally had been coal heated, and we had what was called a coal chute, where the coal was sort of shoveled into the basement. And this guy had entered the basement, and he seemed to leave during the day, but came back at night, and was simply living there. My father said to him, "You know, you really can't live in our basement. You're just going to have to leave. I'm awfully sorry." Went up to the kitchen, got a bunch of food, gave it to him to take with him, and he was on his way. That was my first experience with homelessness, really quite closely. But we also had in our house what was called a vestibule. I don't know if any of you have ever lived in houses with vestibules. It's kind of like a coat closet, but it faces the street. It has an outside door. You walk into it from the street. You hang up your coats, and then there's another door that you enter the house with. Well, we never used it for hanging up coats, and so the outside door was always open. So probably about once a month or once every 2 months, my father would go downstairs to get the paper outside, and the outside door would be closed. And he always knew that there was probably a homeless person who was sleeping in the closet. And sure enough, this happened quite frequently. My father once again would say, "You know, we appreciate you don't have a place to live, but we really can't have you live here." He'd run to the dining room table, grab the bread for breakfast, and give it to the person and tell them that they really needed to leave. I think part of this was because this attitude towards homeless people on the part of my father might have been because he was a product of the Depression. And at that time, people were always coming to your house and either camping out or asking for food. And you were very generous, or you tried to be generous, or you tried to be helpful as much as you could. You didn't call the police, like people probably would do today. You didn't call any authorities, like again we as a society would probably do today. You didn't consider them dangerous. You just said, "You know, we just can't have you here, so you probably need to find another place to go." When I went off to college and then to graduate school, I didn't really have much of a relationship with homeless people. I didn't live in areas where there were many until I moved to South America. And there I became involved working with people who were living in squatter communities. These were people from rural areas who, for one reason or other, couldn't survive there. Probably their land had been taken or worn out or something, and came into the larger cities, put together squatter communities, and where they lived. They're almost like little self-contained towns. And as an anthropologist, I was asked by several of the NGOs, non-governmental organizations, to work in these communities and to give them some ideas of what they could do to better the lives of these people and to help them. When I came back from South America, I arrived here in Phoenix in the early 80s. And some of you may remember that around 1984, we had our own, I won't call it a squatter community, we had a large homeless camp which was located on 9th Avenue and Jefferson. Very large. There was a census that was done at one time while it was still open, and there were about 900 people in that area, living in tents, cardboard boxes, and so forth and so on. Well, I became interested in what was going on, and so I decided the best way to learn was to volunteer at the St. Vincent de Paul dining room, because all homeless people in the area ate there, and I'd be able to sort of figure out really what the lay of the land was. I was pretty sure it wasn't like the squatter communities in South America. So I started volunteering. One of the problems for me at the time anyway was that there seemed to be some sort of a gender stratification in that women volunteers from the churches stayed back in the kitchen. It was kind of like they really wanted to volunteer, but they didn't know if they really wanted to have too much to do with these people who were coming through the line. Men were the people who dished out the food, and they were also the people who gave the trays to homeless people. So when I arrived, I was told, you really need to be back in the kitchen. And I said, no, this woman doesn't do that. I'm not in the kitchen. I want to be out in front. So I managed to work my way up to giving people their trays. And every day, I would say to them, every person who came through, and I volunteered every Saturday, I would say, hi, how are you? The how are you part of it was, I thought about for a while. I mean, how do you say to somebody who has nothing, who has lost their home, who's living on the streets, how are you? How do you expect them to answer? Well, I found that people answered by saying, fine, because we always do that. I mean, when somebody asks you how you are, you don't say, oh my gosh, I woke up with this backache this morning, unless you know them really well. So it was either fine, or sometimes people just looked at me and walked away, and that was okay too. Years later, it was very interesting. I ran into a woman who I'd never met. She said to me, I know who you are, and I want to tell you how much you meant to my son. I said, okay. And she said, I wanted to let you know that he lived for years on the streets, but he always went to St. Vincent de Paul on Saturday, because you were there and you were the only person all week long that talked to him and asked him how he was. I think I caught up when I think about it. But anyway, such a small thing, and yet such a large thing as well. Well, the squatter community, the tent city continued to flourish. It continued to get larger. And St. Vincent de Paul had always wanted to have a homeless shelter. And actually they had rented a big warehouse, but had been told by the city of Phoenix that there was absolutely no way, absolutely no shelters in downtown Phoenix. So they were really stymied. But all of a sudden one day, the city and the state began to think, oh my gosh, here we have this huge homeless encampment. It's sort of right between City Hall and the state office buildings. And what are we doing? We even have tourists coming here. I mean, this is the Valley of the Sun. I mean, we are pristine. We welcome outsiders to come and spend their winters with us. And they're coming and looking at this homeless campus. I mean, we're going to be known for, this homeless camp. We're going to be known for this. And quite frankly, they were slowly, because the Wall Street Journal and the Detroit Free Press and other national type newspapers were writing articles about it. So they finally said to St. Vincent's, okay, you can open a shelter. So then St. Vincent said to me, would you be willing to open the shelter? Would you be willing to get it going for us? So I said, well, I guess so. So the building itself was very interesting. It was a huge warehouse. So the first thing that happened is having to sort of set it up. So the National Guard came with cots and beds and started setting it up. And then there were a group of homeless people that I had met in the dining room who came in as well. And so we set up 400 beds in this huge warehouse. Now, the problem was that we had a population that consisted of a lot of men, a smaller number of women, and a yet smaller number of couples. There was no way to put up temporary walls or anything like that. So the three groups were only separated from one another by a fairly wide aisle. So that's the way it had to be. That's the way we had to do it. There were no bathrooms, so we had porta-johns, which were out in the alley. And other than that, it was very, very simple. Later on, St. Vincent's got the money and really turned it into, with bathrooms and amenities. But this was just a start. I do have to tell you, it was a March, and it was very cold, and it was very rainy. So it was, it was really important to get people out of this particular rainy, cold climate. Well, we went out and we talked to the folks on the streets and in the encampments and said, we have a place for you to be inside. And starting at 2 o'clock, just come on in. Well, I looked out at 2 o'clock and there were all these kind of older guys. And this was a very heterogeneous group of people who were in the campsite. And what were all these just older people standing there waiting for? Well, the people in the campsite had decided that the older folks should go first. Because if there weren't enough spaces for everybody, at least the older folks would be taken care of. So we did manage to house pretty much everybody. And during the whole 4 months that I was there, we never had any problems as far as people sort of crossing the aisles, men going to visit women late at night or anything along that line. It was, people just respected one another. So essentially, we had a few other small problems. One was the first night we were there, the police came and said, something, we're going to come through your shelter once or twice a night. Because, you're obviously going to have some problems, and we'll just be there. And I said, no, I don't think so. Essentially, you'd be walking through people's bedrooms, and I wouldn't want you to be walking through my bedroom 2 or 3 times a night, and I'm sure they feel the same way. So we'll just call you if we need you. We only called them once, and that was when we found that one of our guests had died in his sleep. But other than that, the police never came. We did do a bit of we did have one safety issue, and that was people coming with weapons. We put a big box out. We asked them if they would please leave their weapons in the box, and we would, identify them, and then they could be returned to them the next day if they wanted them. It turned out that the box got really full, and people did not. And there were a couple of guns. Almost all of them were knives. People did not pick them up. Why? Because they had needed the weapons they felt at night, and they had a safe place to stay. We also found that people were extremely generous and extremely kind to one another. They were very helpful, falling over their own feet and mine to do things, to help sweeping, mopping, setting up beds, doing whatever was necessary. And the other thing that they, and of course this was done with no money. When finally 3 of our volunteers were put on payroll by St. Vincent de Paul, I was very, very interested in what they were going to do with their first paycheck. James used his to invite all the volunteers who hadn't gotten paid to go out to an all-you-can-eat buffet. Charles used his to buy an old car so that he could not only get himself out to construction sites to look for work, but could take other people from the shelter with him. And Art, who was a Native American, went to a craft store and bought beads and the materials he needed to make a loom and wove belts that he sold actually to the Heard Museum and managed to support himself that way. I also can tell you of Gloria, who was a woman, another Native American woman, who went out to the empty lots, pulled up weeds, and managed with these weeds to make the most incredible small baskets that she sold and managed to make enough money to get her husband and herself back to cells and the reservation. So these are the kinds of people that we had. And the other thing I'd have to tell you is that people really wanted to help financially as far as the shelter was concerned, or at least as far as in-kind contributions. I would walk into my office and I would smell onions and garlic and find watermelons under my desk. Well, the people who were working in the fields, and we had some of those individuals, would bring in things that they had been harvesting for the folks who were staying at the shelter. And so we would put them out at night, cut up the watermelons, maybe not the onions. We gave those to St. Vincent's for the, to cook up. And then the other thing is I would find checks on my, or not checks, but envelopes with cash on my desk. Usually it was $12. So I finally chased down the people who had left this money and I said, what is this about? And he said, well, we're selling our blood to make money. They're giving us $36. And we thought, normally we would have to pay 30% of our income on our rent. So we're giving you 30%. So I will tell you, this was an incredible experience for me. The generosity, the thoughtfulness of these individuals, not only towards me, but also towards one another. As Bob said, I now run a nonprofit organization that develops housing for people who are have been homeless, who are homeless, who have been homeless, or who would be homeless if they couldn't find an affordable place to live. And I still find this kind of generosity. I still find people helping out their neighbors and really going further than perhaps any of us who have our homes and all the other accoutrements with them to help other human beings. This has been an incredible experience for me, and I would hope for anybody else who might want to become involved in working with homeless people. My very last thing I'd like to say is that I worked for a long time with a guy named Mitch Snyder. Some of you might have heard of him. He was one of the real first pioneer advocates for homeless people in Washington. And one of the things he said, which brings me back to my tray giving or presenting work at St. Vincent de Paul, the charity dining room, he was asked, what is the one thing you could do for a homeless person? And he said, the next time you see a homeless person, don't pass them by. Say hello and ask them how they're doing. So I'd like to suggest that to everybody here. Thank you.